While the light is being investigated, lots of technical issues, but thank you for this healthy turnout given this terrible weather. She's getting a real, Joanna, this is getting a real taste of Canada here. November in Canada. But welcome to our special session, really, the faculty seminar. We have a very distinguished speaker for today's talk. She is Joanna, who is Professor Emeritus of Modern History at Sommerville College at the University of Oxford. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I will not attempt to describe her many publications, which are diverse, excellent, leading publications in the field of 18th century history, British history, but really extending it back into the 17th into the 19th. She's really a field-defining historian. Works, as many of you will know, on diverse subjects from crime to social welfare, cultural history, the Reformation of manners, has published articles, chapters, books, too numerous for me to recite here. He's also was for many years the editor of Past and Present, and still on the editorial board of Past and Present, involved in one of the leading publications in the field. This talk, I'll leave her to describe to you the parameters of the project, but it's an international collaborative project on culture and practices of democracy, it's fair to say. And two volumes have been produced in the project, and a third is on the way. But I won't belabor that because that's the subject of the talk, so I'll leave that to Professor Joanna and ask you to welcome her.
Well, let me also thank all of you for turning out on this snowy evening, and I hope I can make it worth your while, and I look forward to your comments. I'd like to start with the image on the poster advertising the talk. Here it is. We'll look in a moment at what it shows, but let's start with the history of the picture. Can you hear me okay? I can hear, but I'm moving back and forth from the microphone. It was painted by a painter called Graf, for a veteran of the Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans, a man usually known by his nickname, Macrianus. Here's a picture of a scene from that war in which he's said to be one of those on the hill to the right, near the cannon, and a portrait of him in old age. Macrianus learned literacy only as an adult, but he then wrote an autobiography, which is his chief claim to fame. Veterans of the Independence War commonly felt they didn't get enough public recompense for their efforts, and this helped to motivate their participation in an uprising or pronunciamento in 1843 against the Bavarian Otto, who had become king of Greece 10 years earlier when Greek independence was internationally agreed. And what you have here is an early 20th century picture of the 1843 uprising. A further context of that uprising was more general destabilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, resulting from the ruler of Egypt, once an Ottoman general, having expanded his power up through the Middle East to the point of threatening Istanbul itself. Several European powers combined to force him to retreat in 1840. But this seems to have helped to persuade Greeks in areas still under Ottoman rule that maybe the time had come to complete the unfinished project of Greek independence. That didn't happen, but the king did agree to the election of a national assembly, which drafted a constitution which became law in 1844, it's the constitution, establishing representative government on a very broad male franchise, one of the widest franchises operative in Europe at that time. Now, this wasn't talked about at the time in terms of democracy, because in general representative government and democracy were often contrasted rather than equated, but also because the Greek word demokratia had specific connotations. Whereas most European languages had in their lexicons both words derived from the Greek demokratia and from its rough Latin equivalent, res publica, the Greeks didn't have a variant of the Latin word, so they used the single word demokratia to cover the ground, for which other European countries had two words. At this time it connoted especially republic, in the sense of a non-monarchical state. So since the Greeks had a monarchy, they didn't call even the revised form of monarchy that they had after 1844 a democratia. Now, Macrianus tells that he commissions Graf to paint a series of paintings for him in his house near the Acropolis, so that he could use them to instruct other veterans in recent Greek history. Painting features a man called Regas or Regas Velastinis, who continues today to be celebrated as an ideological progenitor of modern Greece. He's the man with the cross there. He was educated for the church. Most advanced education in Greece at this time focused on the clergy. He was inspired by French revolutionary ideas and went to Vienna to plan an uprising against the Ottomans, who then ruled over the Balkans for 5 centuries, but he was discovered and executed. The painting imagined something that didn't happen. Regas descending from the mountains on the left, accompanied by Greek freedom fighters. In the centre right of the painting sits the Ottoman Sultan with Istanbul behind him. Greek notables are shown yoked and bowing before him. By implication, it was going to take a popular uprising to overthrow these collaborators, though in fact interrelations between different groups in the population were complex. Now, Regas's vision of the Greek people was notably broad. It embraced all the inhabitants of the southern Balkans, then a predominantly, though not exclusively, Christian region, in which the Greek language served as a lingua franca. This famous map depicted the area Regas had in mind, and sorry, it's quite difficult to read, it's a rather busy map. What became the first Greek state was a tiny fraction of this, the area below the red line. Later, in the later 19th and early 20th century, the Greek state would be extended by fighting in treaties northwards and to encompass more Greek islands. In his draft constitution, and this is his handwritten version and a transcript and translation, Regas wrote about the Greek democracy, apparently meaning something like collectivity of people. He wrote that the Greek democracy is one despite the fact that it includes in its bosom diverse nations and religions. The Greek people, as he saw it, included all inhabitants of the country thus conceived, without exception of religion and language. He envisaged a republican polity. In fact, the Greek state as founded during the 1820s and 30s differed from his model in several ways. It was a Christian state, mainly Orthodox, though other Christians were accepted. It was hostile to Muslims. During the war, there were many massacres of Muslims. It promoted exclusive use of a newly crafted modern Greek language. But then others in the Balkans with other native languages, such as Albanians, Bulgarians, and Romanians, weren't comprehended within its territory. Democracy was given a new place in Greek political language in the 1860s, when King Otto was overthrown, and a new, this time Danish King George, chosen in his place. Another constitution was devised, in which the reformed state was termed a democratic monarchy, or a crowned republic. The Greek can be translated either way. Clearly, democratia was no longer being contrasted with monarchy. The intention was somehow to fuse different forms. In this context, the already wide franchise was further widened. It's been suggested the relative radicalism of the new settlement owed something to Greeks from the Ionian Islands, coloured yellow on the map. They had been ruled by Venice. There had been a kind of republican colony. Italian influence remained strong there. Italian was the language of the educated classes, even as they passed through several hands, ending up as a British protectorate. But heavy-handed, relatively aristocratic British rule was not popular. In 1848-9, the Ionian Islands, like most of Italy, were swept by radical democratic fervour, though subsequently nationalism became a stronger force in island politics. I'm telling you this story not mainly because you need to remember all these details, though you may want to keep them in mind to think about in relation to other things I'll go on to say. The main point I want to make is simply that there are strands in the history of democracy in 19th century Europe, which I'm guessing will be unknown to most of you. Whether by democracy we mean what contemporaries call democracy, or something that we might call democracy, like representative government on a wide franchise. During the remainder of this talk, I'm going to be introducing you to other varieties of democracy, varieties in thought and practice. But before I develop that theme, I want to frame what I'm going to be talking about in terms of some very large conceptual issues. That is, how we should study the movement or replication of ideas and practices across wide geographical regions, like, say, Europe or the world, taking democracy as an example. Historians and others often think and write about modern democracy as if it was invented in one place, or a cluster of places, perhaps North America, France and Britain, and then diffused from these places to other parts of the world. But diffusion models have come under a lot of critical scrutiny in recent years, partly in the light of post-colonial challenges. A diffusion model might provide a good way of thinking about the spread of some things. I've suggested diseases, plants, animals, languages, religions, books, and the ideas of particular thinkers. It seems reasonable to think of these things as starting in one place and diffusing to other places while retaining an essential identity that makes it possible to identify them as reiterations of the same thing. Though even in these cases, the effects and meaning of what's in some sense the same thing may vary according to context. I've instanced here AIDS, which may have started among primates in Africa, but had different impact and meaning when it migrated to humans, has had different histories among humans in different places. We might tell the same sort of story about the ideas of Karl Marx or John Stuart Mill. But suppose we focus on ideas that we don't define in terms of what one thinker did with them. If we think instead about socialism or liberalism, even if elements of them diffuse, might these not just change meaning in different contexts, but hybridize with existing ideas? This kind of question preoccupies people who wrestle with the challenges of writing the transnational history of ideas. In the slide I've included a picture of the cover of Chris Bailey's book on liberalism in India, which he argues that already strands in Indian intellectual life and culture with which European liberalism could fuse. And how about political practices? Is it helpful to think of them as diffusing? Why do we often model democracy as diffusing and not, say, monarchism or republicanism or constitutional monarchism or modern republicanism? How should we understand the geographically wide and diverse upsurge of interest in democratic ideas and practices in the late 18th and still more the first two-thirds of the 19th century? That's a framing question which I encourage you to bring to the material I'm going to talk to you about. The upsurge of interest in democracy certainly had an important transnational element. As I'll try to persuade you in a moment, the French Revolution played an important part in directing attention to it. And French example continued to be referred to throughout the period I'm concerned with. But using other countries' experience as reference points, whether as inspirations or warnings, doesn't necessarily entail following them. In practice, indeed, people often had limited knowledge about what was being done elsewhere, though they might be inspired or made anxious by whatever it was. And even if they knew a lot, they would almost certainly think it needed adapting in some way to their own local context, which in any case, I've suggested would be likely to colour it, and perhaps throw up other ideas and practices that might be hybridised with it. Democracy is in some ways, I'd like to emphasise finally, an especially bad candidate for a simple diffusion model, at least if we focus on Europe and the Americas. Because throughout these continents, the educated classes started with ideas about democracy that derived from knowledge of the ancient world. So there already existed everywhere relevant traditions of thought, which didn't at this date need to be imported from elsewhere. So how does this come to be a topic that I think I'm equipped to talk to you about? My background is in British history, and my talk will range widely, and cover many places about which I have quite limited knowledge. You may know more than me, feel free to correct me and share your knowledge with me. But for the past 15 years, I've jointly coordinated an international collaborative project on the history of democracy in Europe and both Americas between the mid-18th and mid-19th centuries. The basic premise of the project is that in the middle of the 18th century, though the concept of democracy was widely familiar among educated people in Europe and the Americas, yet it was associated primarily with the ancient world and wasn't thought to to be appropriate to modern circumstances, whereas by the middle of the 19th century, though it remained controversial, it was widely agreed to be a contender for the natural political form of the modern age. So the question is, how did this change take place? Our method of work is to identify specialists, usually from the countries concerned, with appropriate knowledge and some talent for working collaboratively, and to spend as much time as possible talking to them. One thing we concluded from our first phase of work, when we focused on Britain and Ireland, the United States and France, was that although each of these places went through broadly the same process of development, yet there were also striking differences from place to place. In the middle of the 18th century, ideas about what democracy consisted in were widely shared. But as the concept began to be taken up and made to do work in a modern political setting, it acquired associations and connotations that varied by place. This made us think that we should continue our investigation on a broadly country by country or region by region basis. We were fortunate enough to get funding, which allowed us next to look at the Mediterranean, meaning Southern Europe and the Ottoman and Arab world. Over a 3-year period, we held a series of workshops across Southern Europe, and we also ran, during 2 academic years, a research seminar and meeting group focusing on the Ottoman and Arab world. Our second book, published a year ago, arose out of that pattern of activity. In that context, we often thought about questions of diffusion because the Mediterranean region is usually seen as a receptor region, and perhaps one whose experience of democracy came late. But we concluded that wasn't the case. Though there were variations from place to place, broadly speaking, people were as likely to talk about democracy here and to experiment with broad franchises as in Britain or France. In fact, in most cases, rather more than in Britain. We concluded that the history of democracy should be studied synchronously. We should compare the experiences of different countries at the same time. Even if some aspects of times were different, that didn't mean they should be thought of as having entered the same developmental sequence at different temporal points. We aim also to do a volume on Central and Northern Europe, and I know something about that region, partly because my chief collaborator Mark Philp and I contributed an essay surveying European experience to 1850 to an edited book, Democracy in Modern Europe, a conceptual history whose cover I'm displaying here. But currently we're working on Latin America and the Caribbean. An Oxford colleague of mine, who himself comes from Colombia and specialises in the history of the region, Eduardo Posada Cabo, is leading that leg of the project. To conclude this section of framing remarks, I need to turn to a definitional question. What is democracy in our conception? Broadly, there are 2 approaches a historian can take, or you can try in some way to mix the 2. One approach involves looking at words, how people at different times have talked about democracy, or its closest equivalent in other languages. Or you can decide that certain practices constitute democracy and aim to trace the history of those practices. We're clear that words are central to our inquiry, though we're also interested in the history of the practices to which the words relate. This has become an increasingly popular approach. Most of the recent books whose covers I've displayed here take this approach, at least in part. But until recently, it was more common to put practices in central focus, and some people still prefer to do that. Erskine May, who wrote the first survey of the history of democracy in Europe in 1878, essentially proceeded in that way. He wrote about the histories of limited monarchy, constitutionalism, representative government and republicanism. May had written a very successful history of the English constitution, and he saw this as a kind of European companion volume and worked hard on it, but it wasn't very well received and was issued only in 1 edition. Critics thought it wasn't clearly focused, the bits didn't hang together in any meaningful way. And indeed this suggests some of the difficulties of writing a history that focuses on democratic institutions and practices. How do we decide which ones are relevant? If we say it has to entail universal suffrage for adult women as well as men, then the history of democracy isn't very long. And does that sufficiently capture what we now understand by democracy? But if we bundle voting practices, perhaps more loosely defined, together with other things, does that bundle continue to cohere, to make sense as a focus of analysis as we move back into the past? Isn't there a danger that our account of the history makes sense only in as much as it traces a route to a present, which people in the past couldn't foresee and were not working towards? There's also a tendency among people focusing on democratic practice to think that the practice only counts if it operated what they think was properly, with good results. If you had universal manhood suffrage but lots of corruption or interruptions from military coups or civil wars, then it's often said that it can't really have been democracy. But I think it's problematic and indeed odd to try to write the history of political institutions normatively, as if we were to say only good kings count in the history of monarchy. The advantage of an approach which puts words at its centre is that that offers a way to avoid anachronism. We look at what contemporaries meant by democracy, the arguments they had about it, and the ways in which they tried to give effect to this idea. The word had no single meaning, so again we find ourselves looking at a fuzzy bundle of things, but at least these things are connected by the fact that contemporaries associated them with democracy. Initially that didn't include a wide franchise. That association only began to be forged in the 1790s. So if we take this approach, we need to be prepared to be led in perhaps unexpected directions. But an approach which puts words at the centre has its problems too. Sometimes it's quite chancy whether something is described as a democracy or democratic, or as something else like popular or republican. So even if one puts democracy in central focus, one needs to be prepared to widen one's gaze to the associated semantic field. And use of the term was partly fashion-driven, so following the word may mean that one jumps around rather arbitrarily. Still, at least that forces one to think about what was going on when the same word, when things sometimes were and sometimes weren't described as democracy or democratic. Though we put the word in centre stage, we haven't wanted to write just a history of the word, but also to think about the institutions and practices to which it related. The history of how people talked about democracy in this period pretty much has to be a story about political activity and political commentary, because there was very little abstract theorising about the concept. Alexis de Tocqueville's treatise on democracy in America was exceptional, whereas now, of course, one could, in principle, write a history entirely about academic thinking about democracy. It would only sometimes touch on the world of practical politics. You could see for yourselves where our approach takes me in this talk, and see what you think are its merits and demerits. If we're putting words centre stage, let's start with words. There are now some powerful tools available for tracking the history of words, imperfect tools, but still powerful ones. This is a Google Ngram. How many people are familiar with Google Ngrams? Some people, not many people. It derives from a search in the Google Books corpus. That's not just the collection of all Google books, but a special database constructed out of that collection. The Ngram tracks what proportion of items in the corpus contain a given word or phrase in any year. So this graph tracks occurrences of the word democracy in 5 European languages between 1770 and 2000. You'll note that since the Second World War, frequencies and patterns have differed quite notably between different European languages in ways whose logic we can speculate about. But let's shrink the time period to the one I'm interested in, 1770 to 1860. At first glance, this looks like more consistent patterning, though some differences between different coloured lines are evident. It's also very clearly episodic. There were 2 periods when occurrences of the word shot up, around the French Revolution and around the 1848 revolutions. As I'll be noting, that fits with the patterns of practice too, and that these revolutionary periods were periods when people experimented with giving democracy institutional form. Now, some absences from this graph might strike you, like where's the American Revolution? Didn't that set people in Europe talking about democracy, you might wonder? Apparently no, not much, and I think the graph is right about that. If we plot American against British occurrences, you can see that the revolution had more effect on talk about democracy within America, but notably more before the revolution and after the war than in 1776 and immediately following years, And I think closer inspection would reveal that lots of these uses were negative. People in America worried about democracy during the unrest of the 60s and early 70s, and again early in the history of the new state. Patterns of use, in the sense of the meaning of its use, seems to have changed only from the 1790s, when, largely under French influence, some Americans began to talk positively about democracy. Another absence, not much mark left by the revolutions of 1830. And again, I think that's right, as I'll explain, these weren't democratic revolutions, as contemporaries understood the term. And one final thing to note that I'll return to at the end of this talk, the Spanish line, that's the green line, follows a different pattern. It doesn't leap up in the 1790s or the 1840s. It does go up at other times. If we could add Portuguese and Greek data, which the Google Books corpus doesn't let us do, I think they might look more like the Spanish line. So contrary to what this selective graph suggests, not all of Europe in this period marched to exactly the same pattern. When people talked about democracy before the French Revolution, what were they mainly talking about? In the 17th century, there wasn't much talk about democracy as such in modern European languages. The word was known from Greek and Latin texts, and it sometimes appeared in the vernacular, but then often with a gloss to help people understand it. Or it might be paraphrased as popular government, that's the most common paraphrase, or the equivalent in other languages. But in the 18th century, vernacularized forms of the medieval Latin word democratia, a term derived from the Greek, did become part of the standard vocabulary of educated people. Words you could use in books or magazines without having to explain what you meant. It strongly connoted the ancient world, Greece, and, if anything more, Republic of Rome. There was more people studied Latin and knew Roman history. From ancient use, it had two main applications. First, it evoked the turbulent politics of the Greek city-states and the Roman Republic. So here's an illustrated frontispiece to Thomas Hobbes' translation of Thucydides' The Peloponnesian Wars, an influential source of insight. Thucydides was an influential source of insight into the political culture of democracy. And on the right, you see a scowling Pericles, then generally regarded as unscrupulous demagogue. It was only in the 19th century that he was rehabilitated to become an icon of democracy at its best. And beneath him, hoi polloi, the people, doing their troublesome democratic thing. Pericles is contrasted with Archidamos. He appears in Assassin's Creed under the name of Archidamos the Peaceful. And hoi polloi are contrasted with hoi aristoi, the best people, who are sitting around having a civilized talk. Then in the Roman Republic, democracy was associated with demagogues like Clodius, here being dragged to an infamous death. Through these histories, democracy was associated with turbulence, demagogues, and what we might call populism, and with the rise of strongmen in autocracy, either because populist leaders developed into strongmen, like Caesar, or because strongmen took power to quell popular turbulence. So you can see why democracy, considered not primarily in terms of institution, but rather as a political phenomenon, form of political behaviour, encouraged by any of a number of possible institutional arrangements, had a bad reputation, and why Americans, among others, more often talked about it negatively than positively. They saw it as something to avoid. The founders tried to establish a form of republic that would effectively contain democracy and discourage problematic democratic behaviours. The other way people learned to talk about democracy from ancient texts was as an item in a taxonomy, of which other components were monarchy and aristocracy. Taxonomy derived ultimately from Aristotle's Politics, which in the 16th century had been widely studied in universities. These categories continued to be used thereafter. Aristotle suggested that the most stable and best form of government in practice was one that combined all three elements, what people in early modern Europe sometimes called mixed monarchy or a mixed constitution. In this vein, the House of Commons could be described as the democratic element in the English constitution, and it was possible to argue, as for example critics of the long-serving Prime Minister Robert Walpole argued in the 1730s, that the democratic part of the English constitution needed strengthening against the overweening power of the King's ministers. Although the taxonomy remained in use, the politics, like other of Aristotle's writings, fell out of fashion in the 17th century. When I was preparing slides for this talk, I looked for 18th century translations of the politics in Google Books and Gallica. I was interested to find that only these two appear in these extensive collections. Their prefaces, one English from 1778, one French from 1797, make fascinating reading. The preface to the English edition contains the most articulate statement I've yet seen, of a view that I think increasingly coloured 18th century thought about ancient politics. The idea that it was not just past, but primitive. Aristotle's Politics is commended here against what the author takes to be the tide of fashion, because it provides insight into the politics of a past, primitive world. By contrast, the preface to the French edition of 1797 hails it as a stunningly relevant text. Now that we've revived ancient politics, says the author, exactly the things Aristotle describes are going on all around us. So this brings us to the French Revolution. As our Google Ngram suggested, the French Revolution boosted talk about democracy, quite a lot of it negative talk, but some of it positive. We find new positive endorsements of democracy as a possible political option in the modern world, but these took somewhat different forms in different places. I'm going briefly to compare and contrast three positive takes on democracy from France, the Netherlands and Italy, and I'll jump ahead and do the same thing for 1848, looking at different countries, and that's how the rest of this talk will unfold. In the early years of the Revolution, the French were no more inclined than the Americans had been to talk positively about democracy in politics. The Americans had, by contrast, talked positively about the people. The French talked positively both about the people and about national or popular sovereignty. They started with royal sovereignty and saw a need to replace that with something else. As the revolution radicalised after 1792, the language of popular sovereignty was deployed to justify the direct exercise of power by the people. The examples I put on the slide on the left relate to radical appropriations of the concept. When the French talked positively about democracy in the early years of the revolution, it was most commonly in a social context, connoting equality. If democracy remained a problematic term, there was more readiness to endorse being a democrat, someone from the ranks of the common people or on the side of the common people. To be a democrat was to be against privilege. It didn't connote any particular political institutions or practices. Because the turbulent popular politics of the Terror years looked very much like democracy as the ancients knew it, some defenders of the people felt moved to try to formulate positive thoughts about democracy in politics. And here are two examples from speeches by Robespierre. You'll note that Robespierre is very aware that democracy can be used to negative effect, and he doesn't reject those uses. He simply suggests that there could also be good forms of democracy, democracy tempered by laws, and in which the people entrust at least some functions to representatives. It was the conclusion of the Terror from 1794 and establishment of a new constitutional regime from 1795 that cleared the way for more French people, if still somewhat hesitantly, to endorse democracy in politics. The aim of the directorial regime established in 1795 was to get the French Republic back on track. In the eyes of its proponents, this involved endorsing equality or democracy in society, legal privilege being abolished, and this was a good thing. It also involved establishing stable, constitutional and law-governed representative institutions. The political philosophy of the Directory was essentially that the Abbé Sieyès expressed early in the Revolution. people were equal, but playing a role in governing the country was a skilled task, not a human right. Basic political rights, such as the right to vote, could be quite widely distributed, but they couldn't sensibly be given to everyone. Some modicum of independence was needed, and the best proxies for that were income and education. In the later 18th century, it had been common to contrast democracy and representative government. What was normally said was that representative government was the modern analogue of ancient democracy, but a great improvement on it, because it didn't ask the ordinary man to do things he wasn't competent to do. What we begin to find under the Directory is the conflation of representation and democracy. We already saw a hint of that in Robespierre. We saw him suggesting that representation had an important part to play in a good form of democracy. Now we begin to see the phrase representative democracy. What Robespierre had called, following common use, pure democracy, direct democracy, was still seen as problematic. But it began to be suggested that democracy could be made safe through the mechanism of representation. Now, this wasn't a common phrase, so far as I can see, or anything like an official slogan under the Directory. It may more commonly have been used by the regime's critics, who would have liked political rights to be a bit more widely distributed, but the phrase was coming into use. Turning from words to practice, even if the Americans didn't talk positively about democracy when they formed their political institutions, still I think that their political institutions and practices provided a very important model for the French, suggesting possible ways to organise a modern democratic state. But I think it's worth stressing that the French by no means replicated all aspects of American practice. First, whereas the Americans had innovatively put a single person, a president, at the head of their republic, the French, sticking more closely to the mainstream republican tradition, put theirs under a board of directors. Secondly, like the Americans, the French had, especially initially, made many local officials subject to election. But as they also stressed from the start, what voters were to have a say in was who filled the posts. It wasn't intended that those chosen should be accountable to voters. On the contrary, in the French tradition, they remained accountable to central bureaucrats. Third, partly because the focus was on choosing the right people, the French voting system was mainly indirect. It wasn't thought that the poorest voters would know the sorts of people capable of filling responsible offices, legislative or executive. Therefore, they voted for people who voted for other people and so forth, like the American Electoral College, but more comprehensively and through more layers. In the course of the 1790s, the French system evolved in ways that we might see as linked to some of these features. If officials had to be the right sort of people, responsive to central direction, then it was easier to have them centrally appointed. At most, voters might be given the right to suggest names. Nominally, the people remained part of the system. By the end of the decade, the franchise had been extended, and direct voting substituted for indirect. But voting had less and less practical significance. It became largely plebiscitary. Under the Directory, the French system of rule was exported to a series of surrounding sister republics, those coloured orange on the map, in the Netherlands, Switzerland and Italy. In all these places, there was more enthusiastic talk about democracy than in France itself, to the extent that any people were capable of being enthusiastic in these places about something that was effectively French occupation. I think there are two reasons why the word democracy gained more favour in these places. First, none of them experienced anything like the French Terror, the radical phase of the French Revolution. That corresponded too closely to how people had traditionally thought about democracy to make the French comfortable with the word. Secondly, several of these places had already been republics. The Netherlands, Swiss cantons, Genoa and Venice, and other northern Italian states had their own republican histories. It was generally agreed that republics could take either aristocratic or democratic form. The old republics had all been aristocratic, and aristocracy connoted oligarchy and inequality. It wasn't so hard to get people coming out of an old republican matrix to warm to the project of democratizing their republics. so democracy had connotations specifically relating to local political traditions. But even among those who supported this project, reactions varied from place to place. I'm going to illustrate this from the two cases I know something about, the Netherlands and Italy. Dutch supporters claimed to be very relaxed about extending their established habit of self-government, even overriding French caution. As one Dutch leader put it, "We are more accustomed to democracy than the French." By contrast, across much of Italy, there was a sense that the people were underprepared for democracy. In fact, French-style republicanism came to especially northern Italy very much on the back of armies, and it was from the start plebiscitary. It was much theatre in the form of assembling huge crowds and taking mass oaths to new constitutions, but little doubt that French generals, especially Bonaparte, were in charge. The middle picture there shows the festival of the Federation of the Cisalpine Republic. In 1797, people are taking an oath to the new republic, with Bonaparte presiding. In this context, in this Italian context, what especially attracted Italian supporters was the project of democratizing the people, preparing them for self-government in the years to come through programs of civic education. Though there were plenty of skeptics, the right-hand cartoon from Milan, 1799, shows Democrats trying to establish democracy on a dunghill. So in the final section of my talk, I want to look at contrasting ways in which people in different places took up democracy in 1848. But first, I think I need to say something about what happened between these two periods of democratic enthusiasm, in the period when talk about democracy fell off. Though, as you can see from the graph, in many places it did start gradually rising again later, even before 1848. The French Revolution put many people off democracy. The terror seemed to illustrate what people had already concluded from their knowledge of ancient history, that democracy was a bad thing. And that opinion didn't change as France stabilised and then metamorphosed into the Napoleonic Empire, because that also followed the ancient script. Democracy had once more given rise to despotism. Napoleon himself always wanted to be all things to all men, so he didn't go out of his way to disparage democracy. Plebiscitary voting in toothless elections continued under his rule, but the general ambience didn't encourage explicitly democratic hopes and dreams. One way or another, the whole experience tended to delegitimise the word democracy. To the extent that such aspirations survived, it was under another name, the name of liberty. Liberty had been one of the slogans of the French Revolution, became the slogan of the anti-Napoleonic cause around which Europe rallied, even inside France. Liberty was also a suitable watchword for post-war independence movements in Greece and Latin America, and that medal commemorates Simón Bolívar, the liberator. That was also the name given to Daniel O'Connell, leader of the Catholic emancipation movement in Ireland. What it meant to be liberal, a word that acquired political connotations at this time, also varied from place to place. French liberals were relatively cautious, having had their fingers burnt on democracy. Elsewhere, liberals were often champions of some of the radical ideas of the 90s. They endorsed the principle of national sovereignty and wide franchises, but they didn't call these arrangements democracy. Democracy began to creep back into favour as the name of a political option in the 1830s. There were several reasons for that. What cautious French liberals did think was that modern society was inescapably democratic. Privilege and formal hierarchy were on the way out, and indeed the trend all over Europe was for the nobility as a social stratum to lose legal privileges, sometimes at the hands of liberal regimes. Increasingly, the lesser nobility redefined themselves as middle class. What survived, where something survived, were small, titled, wealthy groups of peers, thus in Britain, whose nobility had long had that character, and in Spain. In this context, it could be said that the challenge facing the modern world was to find a form of government that would suit a democratic society. Alexis de Tocqueville famously suggested the United States illustrated how this might be done. even if it might not be an entirely appetizing prospect. His account was welcomed by some European liberals. They began to think the future might lie with a not too terrible form of democracy in both society and government. In terms of practice, in the late 1820s and early 30s, European liberalism took a conservative turn. The French model of liberalism became influential, partly because they had been discouraged by failed revolutionary attempts in the early 1820s. Liberals increasingly set aside the rhetoric of national sovereignty and endorsed constitutional monarchy. They argued for narrowed franchises of taxpayers. On this basis, several liberal groups came to power around 1830 in Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and parts of southwest Germany. But that conservative shift among liberals towards what they called moderatism opened up space on the left for left critics of liberal regimes who started calling themselves Democrats. The pictures show groups associated with the cause of democracy in the 1830s and early 1840s in Britain, Ireland, France, and Poland. The cause of democracy, as it came to be partly reconceived in the 1830s, was a modern political cause defined against a distinctly modern political movement, moderate liberalism. This vision of democracy was strongly associated with calls for representative government on the basis of a mass franchise, though coupled with insistence that representatives should be genuinely accountable to a mass electorate. In the 30s and early 40s, democracy remained a fringe movement, some of whose supporters were too hot for their home countries to handle, such that they ended up in political exile. The cause of democracy flourished in international exile communities who congregated especially in Paris and London. Democrat became a shared identity they could use to bond, even if their understandings of it differed. And here we have Ledru-Rollin from France, Mazzini from Italy, and Karl Marx from Rhineland, Prussia, political exiles all at least sometimes identifying themselves as Democrats. And that's a long essay by Mazzini written in 1847 about the state of the democratic cause in Europe. Now, as we've already seen, and as the graph reminds us, even against the background of a rising trend of talk about democracy, the years 1848 to 51 stand out. We have another surge and then fall in talk about democracy, correlating with the 1848 revolutions. During these revolutions, talk about democracy was everywhere, and much more of it was positive than in the 1790s. Not everyone thought this was a good thing. In the top left, you have the response of François Guizot, leading French liberal politician and ideologist of moderate liberalism. As you can see, he thought this was an appalling development. And his book was a bestseller and translated into many languages. But then the French 1848 revolution was essentially a rejection of Guizot's moderate version of liberal rule. The French wrote into their 1848 constitution the claim to be a democratic republic. This meant, as usual in France, essentially a republic based on principles of equality, now taken to have political as well as social meaning. All French adult males were to have a direct vote in election to the legislature. French example helped to set off revolutions elsewhere. Still, there was also much talk of democracy elsewhere. This wasn't just a matter of others imitating France. As I've illustrated, the cause of democracy had anyway been gaining ground for some years among fringe groups across Europe. And because the revolutions were in themselves obviously democratic phenomena in the traditional sense, pulling crowds out onto the streets, suggesting to the people that they had power, the revolutionary moment set many others thinking how to ride the tide of democratic politics. So to conclude the account, I'm going to look at what the cause of democracy came to mean around 1848 in three other places: the United Kingdom, the Habsburg Empire, and Spain. In Britain, the people who've already embraced and continued to embrace the language of democracy were the Chartists, members of the organised popular movement that, among other things, petitioned for manhood suffrage and other changes to the electoral system designed to strengthen people's voice in politics. The historian Gareth Stedman-Jones influentially argued that the Chartists relied on a rhetoric of reform that had been devised in the 1780s, so they were in that sense a traditional movement, and I think there's some merit in that argument. But it should be added that they made a lot of use of the rhetoric of democracy, which hadn't been deployed with anything like the same enthusiasm back in the 1780s and 90s. By using this language, they aligned themselves with other modern European radical movements. At this date in Britain, they were still unusually using it. I've included bottom left a quotation from Joseph Sturge, leader of a rival movement for what he called complete suffrage, which he hoped would be founded on cross-class unity rather than class combat. Though he supported manhood suffrage, you can see that Sturge continued to use the term democracy in a traditional negative sense, which I think is quite revealing of his movement's ethos. So the Chartists' embrace of the language of democracy marked them out as quite daringly radical at the level of rhetoric. Still, in terms of their political goals and some of their political strategies, they were far from ultra-radical. They didn't aim to get rid of the monarch or the House of Lords, just to strengthen the democratic element in the constitution. And their primary means to that end was mass petitioning. In Ireland, the most prominent champion of democracy in speech was Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, who built up a mass movement to persuade the British government of the case for Catholic emancipation, and had now moved on to advocating the repeal of the British-Irish Union. O'Connell's was very much a top-down popular movement, in contrast to Charters, in which he tried to keep out of Ireland. O'Connell's aim was to rally the Irish people, conceived as an ordered hierarchy against British rule. Note the men on horseback in the crowd at O'Connell's meeting. This was an assemblage of local, especially Catholic society, nothing like a Chartist crowd. O'Connell attracted criticism from both right and left as a kind of demagogic tyrant, as in the Punch cartoon portraying him as King Dan, having his feet washed and kissed by adoring peasants. So two different visions of democracy and sets of practices associated with democracy in two parts of the same kingdom. Let's jump over to the Habsburg Empire, which had been all but untouched by earlier revolutionary movements, but now saw street fighting in Vienna. There was a democratic faction in Vienna and probably a wider network about which I don't currently know much. What you have in the bottom left here is an extract from a Viennese democratic newspaper explaining what democracy is, the rule of the people over other estates. It said that it will certainly triumph. One target for the democratic movement in the Habsburg Empire was the still not only monarchical but very aristocratic political and social order. Such representative institutions as there were took the form of local assemblies or diets, traditionally monopolised by members of the noble order. Feudal privileges remained important in governing the countryside, and there were still serfs. In this context, you didn't have to identify with Democrats to think there might be a case for some modernisation, as that was then conceived. That was something that much more powerful liberals supported, and early in 1849, a new emperor, Franz Joseph, approved a liberal constitution drafted by his minister Stadium that aimed to introduce just such reforms, proclaiming all Austrian citizens equal before the law, abolishing serfdom, and establishing elected, transparent forms of local government. Though, of course, emanating as this did from a relatively conservative direction, none of it was called democracy. Meanwhile, in the wider multinational Habsburg Empire, constitution-making processes founded in effect, if not always in name, on principles of popular sovereignty, got out of hand. Asking the people to elect representatives to draft and approve new constitutions posed the question, who for this purpose are the people? Are all residents of the empire one people? Or are Hungarians a separate people? Or within the Hungarian part of the empire were Croats or Romanians and Transylvania separate peoples? The fact that revolution had also broken out on many of the empire's borders added fuel to the fire by opening up the prospect of a general redrawing of European borders. Historians tend to attribute all this to the growth of nationalism, but I think that these accounts often underplay the effect of what we might term democratic politics on these developments. In any case, none of it achieved very much, because Habsburg armies reasserted control while the Russians mopped up in the east. Finally, for another set of variations, the case of Spain. So the same graph you saw earlier, that everything except Spain is now fate, and the green line stands out more boldly. As I show on this slide, Spanish rhythms reflected Spanish political development, points at which, in a positive or negative sense, democracy seemed relevant to Spanish circumstances. In 1812, the Spanish established a constitutional representative regime founded on something close to manhood suffrage, but channeled through an indirect electoral system to coordinate their fight against Napoleonic forces then occupying much of their country. It was in this context that liberal first emerged in Europe as the name of a political faction, though as you can see, this context also encouraged talk of democracy, not necessarily approving talk. Faced with the restored Spanish monarch set on ruling autocratically, Spanish liberals managed to re-establish that earlier constitutional regime for 3 years, 1820 to 3, before conservative French armies put an end to it. In the 1830s, following a civil war, a constitutional liberal regime was established under a new monarch, Isabella. But as the Graf suggests, like other liberal regimes of this period, this was very much not in self-conception a democratic regime. To establish representative government with an appointed upper as well as an elected lower house and a property franchise. Under this regime, liberals grouped around two poles, so-called moderate and progressive. The progressives occasionally flirted with talk of democracy. On the evidence of this graph, 1848 didn't make much impact on the cause of democracy in Spain. But that's not to say that nothing happened. On the contrary, there was street fighting in Madrid. Those Spanish cities were volatile places in this period, and this was by no means a unique episode. The reason why this popular insurrection didn't make more impact is that it wasn't backed by progressive leaders. Alliances between local military leaders and urban peoples were a standard mechanism of political change in Spain at this time. Elections always favoured the sitting regime, so if you wanted to change things, you had to drive the regime from power by a show of force. But the show of force only worked when powerful military leaders and urban people came together, which didn't happen in this instance, though it would happen again in 1854. We don't know much about how urban protesters in Spain thought and talked about their situation. Their thought worlds are largely under the radar. What did happen at the level of Spanish parliamentary politics in the following year was that a left grouping among the progressives made an attempt to differentiate themselves as a democratic party, issuing a manifesto, part of which you see here. They didn't at this point establish a working relationship with popular groups outside Parliament, but they did start thinking on what basis they might appeal to them. Their vision was of a Spain that would escape the cycle of political instability by establishing a form of government that would promote the interests of all the people. I've highlighted a few aspects of their manifesto that I think are of interest. So they wanted to re-establish the principle of national sovereignty, but whether for tactical or considered reasons, they didn't aim to eliminate the monarchy. They said the government should take the form of a constitutional hereditary monarchy. In fact, one attraction of the language of democracy in some places at this juncture was precisely that, unlike republicanism, it could be thought to be compatible with monarchy. So in that regard, a bit less of a challenge to the established political order. Like most self-proclaimed Democrats at this period, they wanted to follow France in establishing manhood suffrage by direct voting to a unicameral legislature. As in France, this involved going back to an older local model, in the Spanish case, the Constitution of 1812, but with the important modification that voting was to be direct, so that national political figures would have to reach out to the people. Local government was to be exclusively civil. That reflects an important project in the Spanish context to demilitarize politics. Over the next few decades in Spain, the cause of democracy will continue to be associated with the attempt to civilianize politics. To conclude, some general thoughts. What does it matter if there have been many varieties of democracy, if it has meant different things at different times in different places? I think this is a good way to think not only about where they were then, but about where we are now. We don't know all the answers. When democracy doesn't seem to work very well, that doesn't show that it has, in some definitive sense, failed. It's always been a work in progress. The challenge for us as historians in this context is to work out ways of writing the history of something always contested and endlessly mutable, something that took similar but not always identical forms from place to place. And of course that's a challenge to us as inhabitants of the present too. Thank you. Let's do it together. I mean, you notice someone I don't notice.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So there's so many different ways that one could come at this. So I'm interested among other things, in the burden of written expressions of democratic values. We use the word constitutions a little bit. And I wonder if you could just say something about that encoding in written form, either in constitutions or maybe liberal codes of law, which are often quite closely aligned with this. We talked a little bit about legal privilege sometimes, and contrary ways of thinking about democratic values that might not be enclosed in these constitutional documents.
So you don't mean specifically whether the word is used in those documents, but more about whether democracy means those documents.
Or whether it's in practice.
Yes. So I think it very often, and even primarily, right through our period, doesn't mean legal documents and institutions. It continues to be much more behaviour. So democracy is something that happens spontaneously, and often the issue is, look, there's some democracy happening over there, what are we going to do about it? When we started this project, the historian of Ireland and France, Jim Livesey, asked us an interesting question. To what question is democracy the answer? I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And recently I thought, well, I now think I know the answer to that question, though my answer is a bit paradoxical. So I think the question to which democracy is an answer is democracy in two different senses of the term. So democracy, the political phenomenon, is the question or the challenge, and democracy, the institutional arrangements, is the answer to how you deal with that. And I think that's true, even now. We move between those two things, as my final slide suggests, I think, because we see all these big protest movements going on in different parts of the world, and we think that's democracy, even though it's extra-legal protest. So the question, what's the relationship between these desire of the people to have a voice in politics and the institutions which we've tried to construct to deal with that, and continues to be a really central issue for democracy. But what's different now, I think, is we think we know quite a lot of institutional answers. The period I'm looking at, the institutional answers are still very sketchy and provisional. And I think people are starting to think this again now, but in this period I think they think the jury is still out on whether democracy can be made to work. We're doing our best. And 1848 raises lots of new question marks about that project. And a lot of people on the left go away from 1848, in which, after all, French manhood suffrage once again threw up an autocratic figure saying, perhaps we didn't have the answer to how to make democracy work, and perhaps democracy has to involve much more decentralisation of power. Perhaps that's the only thing that's really good. Or perhaps we should forget about democracy and think about socialism, because the answer can't be delivered just through institutions and arrangements. So, but we stop before the period at which the sense we've got the answers, they more or less work, is beginning to firm up in the later 19th century.
Thank you, a great talk. You said that some thinkers thought that democracy was more compatible with monarchy than republicanism. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Is it because in a democracy you need leaders and that's where the monarch fits in? Or?
No, I think it's more, so these are both very fluid terms.
Yeah.
And actually one of the things I keep being struck by looking at how people talk about democracy, I think one of the ways they use it is to think about something which could be just as well described as republicanism, if by republicanism we mean serving the interests of all the people. So democracy comes to have a kind of cross-class appeal, partly because people think we just failed to get right incorporating everyone's interests. And until we do that, we're not going to have a stable political system. And similarly, republicanism is similarly used in ways that are pretty, countries where there's a strong republican movement like France or Italy, it's pretty interchangeable with democracy. But republic also strongly connotes not having a monarch. And people who call themselves republicans in this period usually mean we've got to get rid of the monarch, whatever else we do. Whereas democracy doesn't carry that connotation. On the contrary, if you think of democracy in a kind of Aristotelian framework, then democracy can be part of a mixed constitution of which a monarch is also a part. So kings can say, some kings are saying in 1848, they stopped saying it afterwards on the whole, but they're saying, democracy might be okay, we can have a democratic monarchy. Don't think we have kings saying republicanism is okay.
I know it's unfair to pull somebody outside of their period when you open the door with the last slide.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you would say about the transition to the late 19th century. In particular, everything that you talked about, democracy, all comes before there's a secret ballot anywhere. The Australian ballot is 1870s, 1860s, I forget it. Thereabouts. And most places it doesn't come until 1890s, 1900s. Late 19th century in a lot of countries, I'm not sure how it is in different parts of Europe, but it's certainly in the Americas, both North and South, there's a restriction of suffrage in the late 19th century.
Yes.
Again, the sort of critique of democracy seems to have all sorts of institutional knock-on effects.
Yes.
So what's the story, if you had to draw your story out a little further, what sorts of things would you say?
I had an idea when you started talking because I planned out of my head again. I mean, I think when I was part of the group who was writing the Democracy in Europe, a Conceptual History, we had a couple of workshops at which people who were working on the later period were talking about this. And I think there is quite a lot of variation from country to country in how people are talking. But in Germany, they're not very keen on talking about democracy at all. Despite the fact that Germany is a place which institutes mandatory suffrage, whereas in France, the language of democracy is recovered in the liberal phase of the Republic, I think. So one would continue to need quite a differential sort of history. The thought, it's come back to me, the thought I was going to unfold in the secret ballot. I think the alienness of this period kind of needs underlining, and maybe I need to think through and underline it a bit more than I am. Not only do these people not have secret ballots, they don't necessarily have something you might recognise as party politics. It's not necessarily the case that elections change who the government is. So it's quite hard to, sometimes I think voting in this period is actually more like oath-taking. It's a kind of political demonstration of allegiance than it's a question of choice, which is how we think about democracy. So I think really getting inside this set of practices and what people think they are doing when they're working takes quite a lot of more strenuous imagining, I think, than I've yet totally got on top of. And in a sense, you might say one of the things that's happening in the later 19th century are people are losing some naivety about the idea that people can be given a voice in politics, into thinking there's a war of ideas going on in politics, and the people are on both sides of this war of ideas, but bringing them into the picture.
So this idea of undifferentiated public opinion disappears or something.
Yes, So, if you think of religious conflicts, or the ways in which Jonathan Sperber in his book on the 1848 revolution suggests one of the legacies of those revolutions is conservatives learn that they can play the democratic game quite successfully, and that's important. It's not a lesson which they immediately convert to them, yes, let's keep all these manhood suffrage. They don't tend to think that, but they kind of come back to it later. Manhood suffrage starts catching on and think we can play this game too. So I think there's good reason for us to stop what we do. It's not a simple evolution into the next period. It's quite a shifting gear in which rather different things are happening, and the word is located within a rather different set of practices and expectations.
Thank you. One question, if you can elaborate a little bit on this connection to citizenship,
Yes.
and particularly in sort of participatory democracy, to sort of how that informs who's excluded and who's included. Of course,
Yes.
you said universal manhood suffrage. Well, that's half the population
Yes.
excluded right there.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what the connection over this period is to citizenship
Yes.
and belonging.
I could take the question in two ways. One is in terms of how people are talking about citizenship and using that category, and the other is, I think, more your intention, which is just to think about it in terms of belonging.
Yeah.
But on the first question, actually, different countries do very different things with the category citizen. So if you contrast Portugal and Spain, in Portugal they say all inhabitants, all residents are citizens, because there are certain basic political acts like taking oaths, which everyone is competent to do. So they're all citizens, although only some citizens will have rights, such as the right to vote. We don't have to give them all the full portfolio of political rights. Whereas in Spain they say, we're going to call those people, I forget what the word is, but residents or inhabitants. There might be missing this. And we're going to reserve the word citizen only for people who have the vote. But if you look at people, how people talk in Spain and Portugal, they don't necessarily follow in the line set out by those legal choices. So citizenship's quite an ambiguous category, and I think historians don't always pick up on its various meanings because it's another of these words they use to mean what they're thinking about. I have a sort of, I thought people might ask about women. I've even got some women slides after this blank slide. I think sort of what, and this is a very crude account, but in a society of orders, you can say a society based on privilege. You say we don't really have to explain in terms of people's natural condition why some people have rights and other people. That's the legal order. Some people have been given these rights and other people have been given other rights. Once you start saying everyone's equal, then you open up the question, but then what is the basis on which we actually treat people differently? And then you need kind of naturalistic accounts of why people are different. So instead of saying, well, all the law says that male heads of household are the people who have the legal rights and that's just the way it is, you have to say, well, women are actually inferior. It's not just a legal convention, it's actually something about women or something about other races, so they don't deserve to have these rights. So you shift the kind of debate you have to have from just saying, should privilege be abolished and extended to more people, to saying, is the social order actually naturally unequal? What is it that creates these inequalities in society? So people then have to learn how to make arguments, how to operate within that new context. And the third thing I could say is that, the idea that you have to prepare people for citizenship to participate is very widely held, and education is thought to play a crucial role here. what they do in Spain and Portugal and some other places is say all adult males or all householders can vote now, but in 20 years' time, they're going to have to be literate. And the reason they do it that way is they say, we don't want to exclude people now, but we want to give them a really powerful incentive for becoming literate, because we think that is important. It's just we want, and some countries do it the other way around. They impose the literary test at the start, and they say people have to educate themselves to catch up. So the big interest in education in the 19th century often has an important component about preparing people for this sort of participatory society.
What about property ownership? Sorry, property ownership. Is that still essential?
I mean, you need a criterion you can actually use. So paying taxes on property is often the way that you do it, because you can find out whether someone. So you want to get at something like property ownership, you can do it through tax paying. But even then, you can say you're doing these things. So again, to use a Spanish example, I think in the 1850s they start defining voting rights in terms of contributing to taxes. So they just supposedly rolled out a tax system that's based on assessment of property. But actually the tax system is administered at local level in a way which is not based on fair and equal assessments of property, but has all kinds of manipulation built into it. So it's a bit of a fiction that what you're doing is basing it on property. But that idea is very much, and that's the kind of, this cautious, moderate French liberal idea is you only give the vote to qualified people, and the best proxies for that are property and education. That's how you know if you've got the capacity to function within the system.
You've made a lot of very interesting distinctions, and of course we all have this movement of what we might call democratic authoritarianism.
Yes.
Living through this.
Populism, as people say.
Populism, but I think in some ways it's out of populism. And one distinction that you don't draw, I wonder if you think it has any purchase with material, is that I draw this from Richard Tuxman.
Yes.
The difference between popular sovereignty and democratic constitutions. And a lot of the episodes you describe as democratic moments seem to me are expressions of democratic sovereignty. So they're petitions for reform, they're votes taking, they're plebiscites for Napoleon, these go all the way back to the national government and engagement and so forth.
Yes.
And is that one way to think of that as material and the dynamism of the story you might tell?
Yes. I think it's true that often the most democratic movements are movements on constitutional. We've actually got to refound authority. And 1848, they go for that, and that's why they run into the national problem, because then who are these people that you're refounding everything? It all starts to unravel, and you start thinking, well, actually, maybe we can't throw everything open quite the way we were trying to do. And I think involving the people at these moments of constitutional change often then has knock-on effects. Because you think, once we've done that, we've got to keep people in place. I mean, Italy is a really interesting case because they do the plebiscitary thing in terms of creating united Italy. And then they create quite a narrow franchise. So they make that move which many other countries are hesitant to make. First of all, we said you had a vital place, and now we're saying you're not. But there's an Italian historian working on the early Italian parliament at the moment who says what he's struck by is how the reporting is not at all, in the newspaper coverage, is all about this is the People's Assembly. The fact that only some people have voted for it is not at all brought to the fore in the. So I think there may be presentationally a bit more blurring between the
I just
constitution.
wonder if it explains, in some sense, this paradox we're all interested in, and that is this enlightened despot who can claim democracy.
Yes.
In other words, how Stalin described himself as a Democrat, it was ubiquitous in the 20th century, right? So there's a kind of founding act of popular sovereignty, yet depositing the political interest of the entire country with a cadre of political party and single figures.
Yes.
Vote Trump or Brent.
Yes. Yes.
That might be one way to think.
Yes. I mean, the implications of my resistance to normative histories of democracy is I want to say this is all democracy, it's just that democracy has problematic variants as well as, and I don't think using different words to describe the forms that we do and don't like is a very helpful way to start, even if we might need a vocabulary that allows us to think about the variations.
So in your answer there, you just sort of said, you said, well, first I want to say thank you for this, heroic attempt to synthesize all this, material on this incredibly important topic. And you said in your answer that you want to say it's all democracy, and not the sort of what I kept asking myself during the talk, which is, what's the litmus test for whether it's democracy or not? I mean,
yes.
So sister republics in Italy that seems a pretty low bar.
Yes.
If they make it
yes.
in, but then, you said for the French Revolution, well, they, to be a Democrat there meant you started for a certain period you're against privilege, and maybe that's not really a Democrat, but
yes.
as something works on the time period, being against privilege sounds more democratic to me what was going on in
yes.
sister republics.
Yes.
So,
but as you say, I don't want to do that.
So where is this?
Yes. So I'm not
Where is
saying
the litmus test, or how are you making the judgment of what counts as democratic movement and what doesn't?
how people talk about it.
Okay.
So I don't want to say, I think this is democratic and this isn't, because I don't see how you can do that in a non-anachronistic way. What kind, where are you standing historically when you make that kind of judgment? So what I'm interested in is what people have tried to do with this idea and the many different sorts of attempts they've made to instantiate it, which have we might look at them and we can note each of their strengths and weaknesses. But I think they're all members of this same family of attempts to give meaning to this ideal, which has two main components. And one is give people a voice in shaping the institutions to which they're subject, and the other is no person is intrinsically more worthy than any other person. And those are you need those things somewhere in the mix, but they are wide open to an enormous number of different constructions, and that seems to me I think that's a better starting point for thinking about the history and trying to say there are good bits and there are less good bits. But feel free to argue that the other approach is better.
So, thanks for a really interesting talk. I think my question is about the diffusion element of it, the problems of that model.
Yes.
And how to balance the kind of synchronic approach you take that I think really quite clearly illustrates that this is happening at the same time across Europe. Is how, if at all, do ideas actually move? And is this a transnational history of ideas, or are they how do the containers
Yes.
come about through these processes, or find them or
Yes.
something like that?
Yes. I mean, it's very, I think it's very challenging, both to research and to conceptualize, because it's certainly transnational. People are all the time looking at what other people are doing, and their ideas about what's possible and what's desirable are often constructed in terms of it's working really well in America, or it worked really badly in France. But then the fact that you use these other countries as reference points doesn't mean what you do can be that is just imitative. And even if you intend to imitate, you usually can't do it. As late as 1866, I think it is, in England, in a collection of essays called Essays on Reform, James Bryce wrote an essay about the history of democracy, in which he says lots of people don't like democracy because they look at Greece, they look at Rome, they look at France, they look at America. But actually, if we have democracy in Britain, it's not going to be Greek democracy or American democracy. It's going to be British democracy, which will be different because it's And it doesn't say that will automatically make it good. It will just be different because it's the product of our circumstances and institutions. I mean, what is an interesting, more severe test of diffusion model, which we're not going to get into in the time span of this project, is about ideas of democracy being taken up elsewhere in the world, which is not initially part of the heritage. They encounter democracy as a modern European concept and start talking about it as a possible feature of their societies. So then, the encounter with it as an encounter with something other and not coming from within our own tradition appears much more sharply. But still, I think people tend to gloss it, interpret it in terms of their own existing narratives and existing histories.
Well, it comes to the bottom of the hour. Live discussion, lots of papers, so no more than that, we'll talk.